you don't fall in love with a person. You fall in love with a story, often one you've been trying to rewrite since childhood. Sometimes that story begins in silence, in moments when you learn to hide your needs because they weren't met, in glances that told you emotions were burdens, in households where your joy was too loud or your sadness too inconvenient. And now, as an adult, you're still waiting for someone to choose you without you having to explain yourself, waiting for someone who will finally make the pain worth it. But love doesn't always arrive as healing. Sometimes it arrives as a haunting, familiar, intoxicating, and slowly dismantling you from the inside out. There's a particular ache that comes from being with someone who cannot sit with your pain. They're not cruel. They're not necessarily malicious. But when the tears rise in your throat, when your body shakes with unspoken grief, they go quiet. Or worse, they go cold. You find yourself apologizing for being hurt. You're told you're too sensitive, too emotional, too much. They want the light in you, but not the shadows. And so you learn to split yourself in two. You become curated, edited, smiling when you're suffering. And somewhere deep down, you tell yourself, at least they stayed. But staying isn't intimacy. Presence without emotional safety is just another form of absence. Why do we tolerate this? Why do we stay? Because for many of us, love has always been conditional. You learned early on that your pain made people uncomfortable, that your sadness needed to be hidden. That vulnerability came with consequences. Shame, rejection, withdrawal. So when someone dismisses your feelings now, it doesn't feel like betrayal, it feels like home. You weren't taught to ask, does this relationship nurture my emotional world? You were taught to ask, what do I need to do to not lose them? And so you contort, you adapt, you shrink your suffering into palatable pieces. But the body always remembers, and eventually your silence becomes louder than your voice ever could. Intensity is not intimacy. But oh, how we confuse the two. You meet someone, and suddenly it's fireworks, sparks, a magnetic pull that feels irresistible. They text you constantly. They call you the one before they even know your middle name. You mistake the rush for connection. You mistake being seen quickly for being seen deeply. The pace flatters your longing. You feel chosen, special. And for a moment, it feels like everything you've ever waited for has finally arrived. But intensity is not the same as consistency, and passion without patience is just a performance. The highs are intoxicating, but they come with lows that leave you gasping for air. You feel euphoric one day, discarded the next. You never quite know where you stand. And so you try harder, you give more. You mistake the emotional roller coaster for chemistry. But the truth is, many of us don't crave peace. We crave the adrenaline of being wanted. Because calm, for some, feels like boredom. And chaos feels like home. Why? Because if you grew up in a house where love was inconsistent, where warmth came and went, where attention had to be earned, then instability becomes the blueprint for desire. The nervous system learns to associate unpredictability with excitement. And so when someone comes along who is steady, kind, emotionally available, you might not feel anything at all. You say, there's no spark. But what you really mean is, there's no threat of abandonment. And I don't know who I am without that. We keep returning to the fire, not because we enjoy being burned, but because we're still trying to master the flame that first hurt us. Intensity seduces, it floods the body with a sense of aliveness. But intimacy humbles. It is slow, uneventful even. It is in the quiet act of staying, in the courage to sit with discomfort without running, in the tender discipline of showing up even when it's inconvenient. So the question is not, do they make you feel alive? The question is, can you rest in their presence? If the answer is no, then perhaps what you're calling love is just your nervous system remembering an old wound and calling it home. THE next OU line and THTHENDSK far next MIT compu Teddy. ChatGPT said they say, I'm sorry, and you want to believe them. You need to believe them, because if the apology is real, then maybe the pain meant something. Maybe the rupture didn't happen in vain. Maybe you weren't just discarded, dismissed, disrespected. And so when the words come, I didn't mean it. I was just upset. It won't happen again. You feel a small wave of relief. You inhale, you hope, you stay. But let's be honest. The apology is often where it ends. You don't get change. You don't get reflection. You don't get accountability. What you get is a reset, a momentary balm on a wound that never truly healed. Because for them, I'm sorry. is a release. But for you, it's a contract. You believed the words meant they understood. The way it made you question yourself, the way you felt invisible, the way your nervous system was flooded with confusion. But what they offered wasn't a repair, it was a pacifier. And this is where it gets complicated, because many of us mistake emotional recognition for emotional resolution. When someone acknowledges your pain, even just a little, it activates something in you. Maybe a longing you've carried since childhood, maybe the hope that this time someone will stay after the storm, so you cling to the apology like it's proof. Proof that your pain matters. Proof that they care. But what happens when the cycle repeats? When the same words come after the same wounds? Eventually, I'm sorry, becomes a spell, a ritual, a seduction, and you are lulled into forgiving before you've even been fully seen. Why do we accept it? Because for many of us, ruptures in love were never followed by repair. You were hurt, and no one came to check if you were okay. You were shamed and then told to get over it. You were abandoned and told to stop being dramatic. So now, when someone says, "I'm sorry," it feels revolutionary, but it's not unless it's followed by action. By change, by the willingness to understand the impact, not just justify the intent. True repair is not a clean slate. It's a deepening, a reckoning, a commitment to not reenact the injury. So ask yourself, do they apologize to move forward or to avoid going deeper? Is their remorse a mirror or a mask? Because love that hurts you and then asks you to forget is not love. It's control dressed in regret. Now, let's look at the next red flag. The one that whispers, "Your needs are too much? Would you like me to continue?" You said yes. ChatGPT said, there is a quiet erosion that happens when your needs are labeled as too much. It rarely begins with cruelty. More often, it starts with subtle shifts. A sigh when you speak, a delayed response to your texts, a slightly raised eyebrow when you ask for something, time, attention, reassurance. You begin to question yourself. Am I being needy? You minimize, you delay, you rehearse your vulnerability before sharing it, as if auditioning for a role called worthy of love, and slowly, your nervous system recalibrates. You learn to carry your longings in silence, to crave closeness but never request it, to feel disappointment but wrap it in gratitude. Because at least they're still here. At least they're not yelling. At least it's not worse. But your emotional world has become a negotiation. You monitor their moods before you speak. You adjust your truth to maintain the peace. And inside, something begins to ache. The cost of self, abandonment disguised as compromise. Why do we do this? Because somewhere along the line, love became conditional. Perhaps you had caregivers who were overwhelmed, emotionally unavailable, or critical. When you reached for comfort, you were told you were dramatic. When you cried, you were sent to your room. When you asked for more, you were met with less. And so you learned your needs are burdens, your feelings are inconvenient, your voice is disruptive. Now, as an adult, you still carry that imprint. You enter relationships not with entitlement, but with trepidation. You don't ask, "Is this good for me?" You ask, "How can I make sure they won't leave?" You become low maintenance even when your soul is starving. You take pride in being independent, even though your heart is quietly longing to be held. But here's the truth, your needs are not the problem. The problem is being in an emotional ecosystem where your aliveness threatens the stability, where your authenticity feels like a risk. And so, when someone calls you too much, what they often mean is, "You're asking me to meet you where I cannot go." That is not your fault, and it is not your burden to fix. Love that asks you to be less is not love, it is fear in disguise, and no matter how much you shrink, it will never become safe enough to stay. If you're ready, we'll continue with the next red flag, the one that wounds in the name of humor and calls shame connection. Shall we go deeper? You said nano expente next oe lime. ChatGPT said it starts as a joke. They tease you in front of friends, they mock your dream, your story, your body, your fear. And when you flinch, when your face falls just slightly, they smile and say, "Relax, you're too sensitive." They call it humor, you call it confusion, because part of you laughs too. That nervous, tight-chested laugh, the one you learned to perform when discomfort entered the room. You want to be cool, unbothered, easy. You want to believe it wasn't meant to hurt, but it did. And not just in the moment. It reached something deeper, something older. A younger version of you who remembers what it felt like to be ridiculed in a room that didn't notice you disappearing. A child who learned that love and humiliation can come from the same mouth, often in the same sentence. And so now in adulthood, when someone uses sarcasm as a weapon and then disguises it as affection, your body tightens. But your mind rationalizes. You don't want to seem dramatic. You don't want to push them away. You've been told your emotions are too much, after all. This is how shame enters the relationship, quietly, playfully, laughing as it lands. And it teaches you that your vulnerability is a liability, that if you reveal your softness, it will be twisted into performance. That if you expose your wounds, they will become punchlines. You begin to withhold, to armor, to become emotionally efficient. You don't cry as easily. You don't share as deeply. You start editing your inner life before it ever reaches the other. And in that withdrawal, the intimacy begins to die. Why do we accept this? Why do we stay in relationships where being seen means being shamed? Because if vulnerability was unsafe in your earliest attachments, mockery can feel like recognition. Twisted, yes, but familiar. If your feelings were ignored or punished growing up, even painful attention can feel like connection. There's a strange comfort in being hurt by someone who claims to love you. It reinforces the oldest belief. This is what I'm worth. And culturally, we are taught to equate toughness with maturity. We are praised for being chill, for not making a big deal out of things. But what's often called resilience is actually emotional suppression, and over time, the soul exhausts itself trying to be unbreakable. True love does not humiliate. It holds. It does not mock the child inside you. It kneels beside them and listens. So the question isn't whether it was just a joke. The question is, why is your hurt the punchline? And more importantly, why have you been taught to laugh along? If you're ready, we'll now step into the mirror, the deeper truth of why we keep choosing these same red flags again and again, even when they fracture us. Would you like to continue? You said yes. ChatGPT said there comes a moment, quiet, often lonely, when you begin to realize the pain isn't random. It's patterned. You're not just choosing the wrong people. You're choosing the familiar ones, the ones whose love feels like something you've known before, long before you had the words to name it. You think you're seeking partnership, but often you're seeking completion. You're not trying to fall in love. You're trying to finish a story, the one that began in your childhood when love was inconsistent, conditional, absent, or chaotic. And now you find yourself in a loop drawn to the emotionally unavailable, the unpredictable, the ones who punish your needs or turn your tenderness into threat. And part of you knows better. But a deeper part, the one who still waits at the window of your earliest heartbreak, believes maybe this time, I can get it right. This is the architecture of emotional repetition. You're not weak. You're not broken. You're loyal. Loyal to the wound. Loyal to the younger version of yourself who never got closure, who never had someone come back and say, you mattered. I was wrong to leave. So you go back unconsciously to the scene of the crime again and again, not because you enjoy the pain, but because you're still trying to transform it. This is the paradox. We seek healing in the arms of the one who reminds us most of the person who hurt us. Psychologically, it's known as repetition compulsion. Emotionally, it's an unfinished prayer, a longing not just for love, but for justice, for reparation, for the feeling that maybe this time you won't be left. Maybe this time your needs will be honored. Maybe this time love will mean safety, not sacrifice. But here is the radical truth. Healing doesn't come from reenacting the old wound. It comes from recognizing it, naming it, saying, this was my emotional home, but it doesn't have to be my future. And that recognition, it requires grieving the love you never received. It requires letting go of the fantasy that someone else will come and rewrite the past. There is no partner perfect enough to heal the child who was never seen. That work is sacred, and it's yours. So before you chase the next apology, the next redemption, the next, maybe this one will be different, pause. And ask yourself, am I choosing love, or am I choosing what feels familiar? If you're ready, we'll now step into the next threshold, how to break the cycle and finally begin again. Shall we continue? You said yes. ChatGPT said, there is a moment in healing that feels like betrayal, not of the other, but of the self you used to be, the self who tolerated, who rationalized, who excused, the self who called abandonment independence, who called emotional starvation not needing much, the self who believed that suffering was part of love's contract. To break the cycle, you must first mourn that self, because she did what she had to do to survive. You see, these red flags are not just patterns. They are coping strategies with costumes. You learned them in the rooms where you were first shaped. You learned that love meant anticipation, that to stay connected, you had to disconnect from yourself, that if you could make yourself easier, quieter, more accommodating, you might finally be enough. And so, breaking the cycle is not just about saying no to others. It's about saying yes to the parts of yourself you silenced along the way. It begins with noticing. Noticing when your stomach clenches after you speak your truth. Noticing when you call it butterflies, but it feels more like anxiety. Noticing when someone pulls away and your first instinct is to fix yourself. These are not random responses. They are echoes. Echoes of what your nervous system learned to do long before you had a choice. And then the deeper work, regulation, safety is not just an idea. It is a felt experience. Your body must learn to feel safe in presence, in slowness, in emotional availability. Often we say we want consistency, but when it arrives, we don't trust it, we brace, we sabotage, we grow restless. Why? Because calm love doesn't activate the adrenaline of survival. It doesn't spike the same chemical high. It is quiet, predictable. And to someone shaped by chaos, that quiet can feel suffocating. This is why healing requires more than awareness. It requires practice. You must learn to stay with your discomfort. Stay with the unfamiliar tenderness of being treated well. Stay with the boredom of stability. Stay with yourself long enough to let your nervous system rewrite its script. You will be tempted to return to the old flames. Not because you miss them, but because you miss the version of you that hoped they would change. Be kind to her. She loved as best she could with what she knew. And then walk on. There will be love after this. But it will not be built on fantasy. It will be built on clarity, on recognition, on mutual regulation, on the radical belief that you no longer have to abandon yourself to be loved. Now, shall we walk through the final door? The one that asks, with trembling hope, what does it mean to choose differently? Shall I continue? You said, yes. ChatGPT said choosing differently is not an act of bravado. It is not a grand declaration shouted from the mountaintop of healing. It is quiet. Unsexy, sometimes excruciating. It often feels like loneliness before it feels like freedom. Because to choose differently means to interrupt the story, the one you've rehearsed for years, maybe decades. The story that says love must be earned, that closeness is dangerous, that your value is tied to your ability to tolerate pain. To choose differently means sitting in the stillness where the old chaos once lived. It means walking away from the one who gave you just enough to keep hoping, but never enough to feel secure. It means deleting the number you used to stare at, waiting for it to light up again. It means not answering the late-night apology that comes without repair. It means saying no, not just to them, but to the version of you who once found her worth in being chosen by the one who couldn't choose her fully. And most of all, it means turning toward yourself. You see, we speak often of being ready for real love, but readiness is not about finding the perfect partner. It is about cultivating the internal conditions that can recognize safety when it arrives. It is about learning to receive without bracing, to ask without apologizing, to need without shrinking. Because the irony is this, the love you long for will often feel boring at first. It won't spike your anxiety. It won't leave you guessing. It won't make you prove your worth. It will feel steady, soft, even awkward at times. And your nervous system, conditioned for the roller coaster, might whisper, this can't be it. But stay, because this is what safety feels like: unfamiliar, unearned, and deeply disorienting until it isn't. And when it settles into your bones, when you find that you can be both held and free, both flawed and loved, then you will understand choosing differently was never about finding someone new. It was about becoming someone who no longer fears peace, someone who no longer confuses pain with purpose, someone who doesn't abandon themselves in order to belong. This is the invitation to love, not from fear, not from fantasy, not from the H to complete a story that was never yours to carry, but from the clarity that you are already whole. So if you recognize yourself in these patterns, you are not alone. You are not broken. You are becoming. And now the question is not, will they ever change? The question is, will you finally choose you?